storytelling, and also to try to back up their initial claim, the prosecution's that is, that George Zimmerman filed Trayvon Martin as a bad person, as a suspect from the very moment he spotted him on that night, February 26th in 2012. Were they effective at doing that? There were moments where they were able to show that there was some interesting developments. One of the things we had not heard before, and those of us who have followed this case closely thought we knew everything, was Doris Singleton. She's the Sanford police officer, the first officer to take the initial statement by George Zimmerman. And one of the things that shocked her, or actually she said she was surprised that George Zimmerman seemed shocked to learn that Trayvon Martin had died. Listen to this.
He noticed your cross, I think you said?
Yes.
And asked you whether or not you were Catholic?
Yes.
And he told you that he was Catholic?
I don't know that he said he was Catholic. He asked if I were Catholic, and I told him that I wasn't, so I assumed that he was Catholic.
All right, and then you told him you were Christian, and his response was what again?
Because in the Catholic religion, it is always wrong to kill somebody.
And your that?
Was that if what you're telling me is truthful, then I don't believe that that is what God means when he means to kill somebody.
Is it your opinion that if what he was telling you is true, presuming that it was true, it was your suggestion then to comfort him in whatever he was working through?
To let him know if he was being truthful that he was in fear for his life and he had to kill Trayvon, that I don't believe that was what God meant.
Okay. And then I think it was just right after that that you had said that Trayvon Martin was not identified yet?
We did not know who he was.
And that was, yes. And that was when you communicated that to George Zimmerman, correct?
I don't know if it was directly at that same moment, but yes, we spoke about not being able to know who the victim was. Mm-hmm. Or I made a statement, I don't know what was in response to, was that we hadn't yet identified the victim. And
his response was that he didn't even realize that Trayvon Martin had passed, correct?
He gave me like a blank stare on his face and said, "No, what do you mean? You don't know the victim?" I said, "Well, we don't know who he is." And he said, "He's dead?" And I asked him, I said to him, "I thought you knew that."
After that police officer, the lead investigator, took the stand, Chris Serino. And again, the prosecution tried to point out inconsistencies, but Mark O'Mara for the defense quickly came back and rebutted and said, however, there may have been different ways he told the story, but was there ever a way he told it differently that made you suspicious of George Zimmerman? And in fact, the lead investigator said, no. Wolf?
Martin Savage on the scene for us in Sanford. Let's dig a little bit deeper right now with our legal analyst, the former federal prosecutor, Sonny Hostin, the criminal defense attorney, Mark Nijame. They're both in Sanford. Also joining us from New York, Diane Diamond, special correspondent for Newsweek and the Daily Beast. Diane, you were watching all of this very carefully today. What was your bottom line assessment on this, day 6 of this trial?
My bottom line assessment is that whatever evidence is in the pot that the prosecution is bringing forward, the defense has been able, quite ably, I think, to turn it around to their benefit. I'm not saying the prosecutor's doing a bad job, but what I'm saying is when you get the two police detectives who had the most contact with this defendant immediately after the shooting, both sort of being sympathetic to him, talking to him about God and God would forgive you if you shot someone in self-defense, and then the male detective saying, I told him he was going to have problems, anxiety, we would get him psychiatric help. I got to tell you, Wolf, I think that there are defense attorneys across the country slack-jawed tonight, having watched this, thinking what a great job Mark O'Mara did. It will be taught in law schools, I'll bet you.
Sonny, what do you think? Did Mark O'Mara do a brilliant job?
I think Mark O'Mara is a very skilled attorney. I think he did a great job. But again, I think, you've got to look at the fact that a lot of information came in on direct examination that I thought was very helpful to the prosecution. They are going step by step by step in putting their case together. And as Diane just mentioned, you know, it's sort of a balancing act at this point. There's a lot coming at this jury. I wouldn't go so far as to say that the prosecution had a bad day, that the prosecution's case is going badly. But again, Mark O'Mara is a very skilled defense attorney, and I think he did a good job today.
In effect, we did hear George Zimmerman, maybe you could even say testify, because they allowed the playing of an interview that he did a walkthrough the day after the killing of Von Martin. They allowed jurors to hear what he said on that day. Let me play this clip.
He said, "Yo, you got a problem?" And I turned around and I said, "No, I don't have a problem, man."
Where was he at?
He was about there, but he was walking towards me. Somebody here opened the door, and I said, "Help me, help me." And they said, "I'll call 911. I said, "No, help me. I need help." And I don't know what they did, but that's when my jacket moved up, and I had my firearm on my right side hip. My jacket moved up, and he saw it. I feel like he saw it. He looked at it, and he said, "You're gonna die tonight."
All right, Mark DJ, what did you think of this videotape that was played in the courtroom?
Well, normally you tell a client never to talk. Zimmerman made a choice to go in and talk without an attorney, and he was unscripted and laid it all out. Now you have law enforcement saying that all of his statements are basically truthful, that none of them are inconsistent with other statements that he's made, and we now know that Mr. Good, the neighbor who came out, gave a story that was consistent with that. You know, that's a lawyer's dream. They don't have to now put on Zimmerman on the stand. They've got him coming across as a living, breathing human being. He's looking decent, he's sounding decent, and the officers are confirming and corroborating his testimony. That's a good thing for the defense, so they can now not subject him, presumably, to cross-examination when it's time for them to put their case.
Yeah, I assume he's not going to be testifying directly, and let me get Diane back into this conversation. Diane, really, based on what we just heard on that videotape, there's really no need for his defense attorneys to put him on the stand.
Right. He testified, in effect, George Zimmerman testified in court today on that videotape, and he wasn't cross-examined. That's the important thing. You know, I think that it's very important when they play a tape like this and we all say, oh, look at how great, and his story hasn't changed at all. In the jurors' minds, they might not be what Zimmerman said at all. Again, the prosecutor is not doing a bad job. This is only the 25th witness in the second week of this trial. Now, so there's a lot more to go, but I think it's important to note that George Zimmerman's story doesn't change. It doesn't substantively change about the fight, about how the gun went off, about being cooperative with the police officers. He comes across flat affect, no real emotion, but that's the way he is sitting in court, too. So I really hope that the jurors could hear some of those tapes today. They were kind of tough for us to hear, and really hear that sort of examination between the good cop, bad cop.
Go ahead, honey.
I think that's right in terms of the statements being consistent, but where he is somewhat inconsistent or where he seems to waver is when he talks about following George Zimmerman on direct. When you look at all the statements, he says, we don't need you to follow him. The dispatcher says, okay, but he really is pressed by both Serino and Singleton, and they say to him, yeah, you know, you told me one thing, which was you weren't following him, or you just got out to look at a street sign, but now you seem to be responding to the fact that he was running, and I hear wind in the background. Sounds like you were running. He says, well, I was just, you know, going in the same direction as you were, and Serino says, well, that is following. So I think when you talk about the initial aggressor, the real important bit of this case, well, I don't know that George Zimmerman did himself any favors when he was talking about following and not following. I don't think he was very consistent, and I think that's a very, very important part of this case.
All right, hold that thought, guys. Hold that thought. We're going to have much more from the Zimmerman trial a little bit later this hour. And by the way, don't miss a CNN special report, The N-Word. That will air right after the Situation Room, 7 p.m. Eastern. Don Lemon has a special report. Stand by for that. Much more coming up on the Zimmerman trial. Also,